entire year. And you may think, wow, a whole year in one book. Well, it's not one book. It's 4 books in reality. Luke being, interesting enough, the longest of the 4. And we'll see that as we observe some of the details that he goes into. We'll notice the lengthy explanations he gives. Mind you, a little bit of a doctor. I wonder why, because that's the nature of the man. So let's begin with a simple question. Who wrote the 4 Gospels? The first, of course, is written by a fellow named Matthew. He was a former tax collector and an apostle. We're going to look at what he did. In the next slide, you'll notice that Matthew wrote primarily to the Jews, and so he emphasized the concept of the kingdom of heaven. He frequently quotes from the Old Testament. In fact, he has over 100 quotes from the Old Testament, and his emphasis is on Jesus as king. Now, if you think about the Jewish view of things, it makes perfect sense, because they're looking for a Messiah. They're looking for a king to rule over them. And so you'll see the word kingdom some 55 times in the book of Matthew. And just to give you some examples of that, you can look, for example, at chapter 3, verse 2, right off the bat. This is John the Baptist saying, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." And you get on into chapter 4, and you're going to see it again. Verse 17, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand." But this time, it's Jesus that's talking about it. When you get on into the Sermon on the Mount, you're going to see the concept of kingdom thrown out several times. For example, the 3rd verse of chapter 5, it's the first of the Beatitudes. And notice he says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." You go on down, and in verse 10, we find again, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." In verse 19, "Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I say to you," verse 20, "that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven." So you see, and it's emphasized repeatedly throughout. When you get to the prayer of Jesus in chapter 6, the model prayer that he gave them, in verse 10, he says, "Your kingdom come, your will be done." And then as he closes the prayer in verse 13, he says, "For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Amen." So this kingdom idea comes over and over again. Verse 33 of chapter 6, "But seek ye first the kingdom of heaven," or of God, "and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you." Obviously, we keep going, but I'm not going to read all 55 references that are to the word kingdom in this book, but it lets us know a little bit about Matthew and his emphasis. Okay, then you've got Mark. Mark is a young preacher. He is the John Mark of the book of Acts. His mother, Mary, let her house be used by the church. You see that in Acts chapter 12. He's the cousin or the nephew of Barnabas. And Barnabas is strongly favors using John Mark, but you may remember that John Mark runs afoul, so to speak, of Paul, because he leaves them on the first missionary journey, and Paul's not pleased with that at all. Later, however, Paul will come back and say he's useful to me in the kingdom when he writes to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4. And he also talks about him in Colossians. I believe it's chapter 4 there as well, but you need to double check me on that. But John Mark, a young preacher. So Mark wrote to a non-Jewish audience, and I put in parenthesis, likely Roman. He focused mostly on what Jesus did and presenting Jesus as a servant. Now, I want you to think about this. The Romans were a lot like today in the United States of America. Busy, busy, busy. They're not interested in talking about too much about teaching. They want no action. Give me the action. Well, Mark does that, but in the process, he presents Jesus as servant. And again, think about the Romans. This would be counter to them. They want people to serve them. They want to be in charge, but Jesus is the servant as presented in Mark. Luke is a doctor who accompanied Paul on several of his missionary journeys. If you look in the book of Acts, you'll discover the we passages, W-E passages. And whenever that happens, then Luke is with Paul. And then sometimes you'll see that suddenly he's not there because it's not we, but they did this, they did that. So Luke is there often. He is there with Paul when he gets to Rome, which means he was on that ship that wrecked and survived. So quite interesting to discover that. Luke wrote to a Greek audience, and he presented Jesus as the Son of Man. There are 31 references in the book of Luke to Son of Man. Now, why would he do that? Well, think about the Greeks. The Greeks had a view of God and man that was quite interesting. God, they said, is totally good. Well, we'd say that's right. You got that one right. In fact, Jesus, in his answer, you may remember, to the rich young ruler, said there's none that's good but God. And so that's correct. The Greeks got that part right. But the Greeks also said that flesh was inherently evil. That's not right. It's not. Flesh was made by God. It's not inherently evil. Now, is it used sometimes for evil? Well, that's pretty obvious, isn't it? Of course it is. So when Luke comes along, he's saying to the Greeks, hey, look, Jesus is Son of Man. Jesus occupied flesh. And that's quite a discovery for the Greek speaking people. And then the fourth gospel, which, by the way, is it's kind of interesting. They call Matthew, Mark, and Luke the synoptic gospels. Why? Because they're fairly synonymous in their approach to things. They cover much the same material. Different points of view, no doubt about that, but much the same material. John is called the autopic writer of the gospel, and that is, he's the only one that writes like he does. John is a former fisherman, talking about physically a fisherman, and he is the beloved apostle, I think, at least, of the book of John. Most people that have studied this agree with that, but no, you don't have to. I'm just saying that's what it appears to me as I read this book. John presented Jesus as the Son of God. Now remember, Luke, Son of Man; John, Son of God. And that's an interesting contrast between those two. He stressed his deity and is sometimes thought of as the gospel for the church. Now that's kind of an interesting thought. The gospel for the church. It's the gospel of belief. Now, John, we think, was written much later than the others. And so he wrote likely during the time when persecution had grown against the church. And so there's a temptation to give up and to leave and not. And so John emphasizing belief is very important because he's trying to say, look, you're following the Son of God. You know, you can't give up on that. You got to stay with it no matter what. And so these are the four gospel accounts that we'll be looking at over the next about 1 year. If you would, turn with me to the book of Galatians, Galatians chapter 4, verse 4. And here the Apostle Paul, writing to the churches of Galatia, by the way, not to a single church, but to a region, to all the churches in a particular region. And in that writing he says, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. What do you think of when you think of this fullness of time? Give me an example. Something maybe, it doesn't have to be biblical. Yes. Okay, when God was ready to send him, okay, fullness of time. I'll tell you what I think of when I think of fullness of time, maybe because of something happened just lately. We have this big, wonderful pan of lasagna. And the counsel was put it at $3.50 for 1 hour, but then make sure the noodles are done. See, you don't pull it out and eat it when the noodles are still hard and kind of still a little bit raw. That's the point. So fullness of time might be longer than an hour, mightn't it? It might be less than an hour, but not likely. But you get the idea. Fullness of time means when things are ready. That's the point. When things are ready. And yes, it's when God's ready, but God's only ready when man is ready. And we're going to look at some things that I believe play a role in that. Now, everybody in here has at some time or another read Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2 is the great dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. It's of a giant image, you may remember. It's got a head of gold. It's got shoulders and upper body of silver, arms of silver. It's got a belly of brass. And then it's got legs of iron. And then at the bottom there, iron mixed with clay. So then in that dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, he saw a rock that was cut out, not with human hands. Who cut it out then? Well, God did. And that rock, rolls down and strikes that image, and the image just turns to dust. Just is destroyed by that rock. And then that rock grew and grew until it encompassed the whole world. Okay, what's that talking about? Well, aren't we thankful that God gave Daniel the interpretation of it? And he begins by saying, you, O king, that is Nebuchadnezzar, are the head of gold. So the first kingdom in this story, this dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, is the kingdom of Babylon. And the kingdom of Babylon is going to be defeated ultimately by another kingdom, the Medo-Persian kingdom. And it is the silver in this story. And then comes a third worldwide kingdom. That's the kingdom of Greece, and particularly Alexander the Great, who died at about age 32, very young to die. But he'd already conquered most of the known world at that particular point in time. We'll come back to Alexander and his kingdom a little bit later. And then following the Greek empire would be the Roman Empire, the longest lasting of these four empires. An empire that was very powerful, smashing things as it goes along. That's the iron image. But later in its life, in its existence, Rome became a mixed type of empire. Had lots of people from all over the world, and they didn't congeal very well, you might say, and they made it fragile, like iron mixed with clay would be. And the stone, as I said, not cut out with human hands. There's got to be God that cut it out. The stone is, it's ultimately the fifth kingdom. It's the church that's going to come. When's it coming? Well, as Daniel makes clear, in the days of these kings, he's talking about the kings of Rome. That's when the church is going to come along. That's when the kingdom is going to come along. And by the way, again, that's very counter to the premillennialist view of things. They don't think the kingdom's come yet. Well, if it hasn't, then God's not God, is he? Because he got it wrong. He said it would be established in the days of the Roman kings, and I believe that it was. Okay, some other things we need to know about the fullness of time. We have the Samaritans. The Samaritans are a mixed race that had to be taught about the God of the area. They're mixed because some Jews had to be brought in. They literally, what happened is the Assyrians would conquer a people, and they would take them and they would move them to somewhere similar. Now, let's just imagine for a minute that the United States, instead of being united, that it's a whole bunch of kingdoms. Okay, so let's imagine that the people of Alabama are defeated. Where could they move the people of Alabama and it'd be a lot like their home? Well, they move them to Mississippi because the two states have a lot of similarities, to them, okay, to each other. Well, then if they conquer Mississippi, where are they going to move the folks from here? They're going to move us to Alabama is where they're going to move us. See, that's the way the Assyrians did it. You don't have to like the illustration, folks. It's just an illustration, okay? I'm not cheering for a certain team or anything like that. I'm just demonstrating the point on this particular case. Okay, so they took people from a conquered place that was a lot like Israel, and they brought them in there. But guess what? God wasn't happy because they weren't worshiping him. And so he sent lions, and people were being eaten alive. And they started telling the Assyrians, hey, we got a problem down here. And so the Assyrian government sent for Jewish priests, some Levites, to come teach the people how to worship the God of that area. Now, they didn't do a very good job of it, to be honest, because they still really worship according to Jeroboam and that approach. But it's a mixed race. A group of people that had to be set up. Well, then, following the death of Alexander the Great, we mentioned that a while ago. That's the third kingdom. His kingdom was broken into four parts. The two dominant parts are the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, and Ptolemies spelled PT, not, which is weird to me, but that's the way it is. The Ptolemies dominated the area around Egypt, and they tended to dominate Israel from about 323 BC to 198 BC. Then the Seleucids are up from around Assyria, up in that area of the world, Damascus, that part of the world, and they tended to dominate the children of Israel, the Jews, from 198 to 165 BC. The last of their rulers was a fellow by the name of Antiochus, and he really wasn't called Epiphanes. That's the name he picked up. Epiphanes means manifest, and he thought that he was the manifestation of Zeus on earth. That's what he thought about himself. And so, by the way, the Jews took that name and instead of calling him Antiochus the magnifier, they called him Antiochus the maniac. They changed his name. I find that interesting. But at any rate, he finally was so mean and so vicious to them that the Jews, led by a priest by the name of Mattathias, fought for and won their independence. And they were independent for about 100 years. The Jews, once again, independent from 165 to 63 BC. But then, in 63, the Jews were conquered by the Romans under Pompey the Great, and they were put under Roman rulers. Now, you might say, what's all that got to do with the life of Christ? Well, it's got a lot to do with it. And we're going to see more about that as we go along. But you just think about it. Why did the Jewish rulers not just kill Jesus? Because they're not in charge. The Romans are. So who do they go to? They go to Pilate, a Roman governor. And they asked for permission to do this. Now, Pilate was a weak governor, and he submitted when he shouldn't have. But that's what God planned on in the first place. So time was right. Perfectly right. All right. We want to look at the land of Palestine. So I've given you a map to look at. And then the next slide, the one that's right beside it, tells a little bit about it. And by the way, there's a mistake in the first line of that. I call myself really doing a good job proofreading on this, and 2 words are still wrong. Isn't that why you have a job, Hiram? Is you go behind people and find their messes? Well, see, I need you to look at my stuff. Okay. All right. So knock out the word given part. That's redundant at the least and doesn't make any sense. God gave the children of Israel the land of Canaan. Now that we're going all the way back to when they came out of Egypt. By the end of the Old Testament, God's people were known as Jews. You know, God didn't call them Jews, but that's the name that they acquired over time. In Jesus' day, the Jews dominated Judea, and because Jerusalem was there and was visited many times by Jesus during the feast days, then Jesus was around the Jews a lot because of that. Then we've got Samaria. And Samaria is the mid-range. And if you look at that map, you'll see that. Judea is at the bottom. Samaria is in the middle. And remember, it's occupied by a mixed breed of people that knew somewhat about God. And it stands in the middle of Palestine. And then there's Galilee. That's up at the top. Galilee is a mixture of Jew and Gentile. And by the way, this is where Jesus spent most of his life was in Galilee. So as we look at the life of Christ, we'll see that quite a bit. What about language? Well, if you're looking in the Old Testament, the Jewish people spoke Hebrew. But when they came out of captivity, for the most part, they'd picked up a new language, which is kind of a Hebrew mixture. It's called Aramaic. And that's the language that they would have spoken in Jesus' day. The universal language of the world at that time was Koine Greek, Koine. You can see that on your notes there. Koine, if you put that in yours and my language, just call it common man, common language. It's not classical Greek. Classical Greek was spoken by the highfalutin people. That's what I'd call them. But Koine is spoken by everybody. It's the language of the common people. And I find it very interesting that that's the language in which the New Testament is written. Because Koine has so many interesting and vivid images that are used in it. So I love to look at words that Paul used. Because he would use a word that had such a interesting background and helps us understand what's Paul talking about here. By the way, Paul was fluent in multiple languages. You ever notice that? He certainly could speak Hebrew. He stunned them when he spoke in Hebrew in the book of Acts, about chapter 22. He obviously would have spoken Aramaic because he had to function with the common folk around Jerusalem. And then he also spoke Greek. And he's able to use that when he goes to certain areas, like Antioch of Pisidia and Corinth and on we could go. All those places would speak Greek. He could do that. Then the official language of the Roman government was Latin. So when Jesus is hung on the cross, they put the accusation above his head on a placard, we would call it, and the placard had 3 languages on it. Guess what the 3 languages are? Well, not too surprising: Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. So now it covers everybody that's going to be in the audience. They all can read what the accusation is. Now, the Jewish leaders don't like the accusation. King of the Jews. They said, they wanted Pilate to put something like, well, he said that he was king of the Jews. And Pilate basically said, I've written what I've written. I'm leaving it alone. Well, Pilate was right. I don't think he knew that he was right, but he was right. Jesus was literally the king of the Jews, and for that matter, really the king of the whole world. People's occupations changed during the time of Jesus' day. If you go back and look at the Israelites when they first come into the Promised Land, they're primarily farmers. They farmed olives. They farmed grapes. You find them farming barley and wheat. And that, by the way, the barley harvest is a part of what of Pentecost. That's a celebration of the beginning of the harvest. It's where they offer the wave offering, giving thanks for the harvest they're about to receive. So that's the way it was. But that changed. In the captivity, they found a different talent. They also had a talent for being for being in the trades, and they also were extremely good businessmen. And so, would it surprise you to think that when you go into a major city of the first century church, that you're going to find that the Jews are only where the crossroads are. They're primarily where the crossroads are. So no surprise that they would be, say, for example, in Antioch on the Orontes, because there's major roads that cross there. Or Antioch of Pisidia, you're going to find the Jews there. In Corinth, well, of course you'd find them there because that's where the ships would put in and they would haul their goods across the peninsula and on the other side load them back on the ship. That was so that the goods didn't have to go around the Cape, because the Cape down there was very dangerous. And you might lose your stock, if you send it that way. And so instead of doing that, they would haul it across by hand to the other side, and the boat would go around by itself. Now, if the boat was small enough, they had another solution, and that was they had logs up there, and they had slaves, and these slaves would pull that boat up onto those logs, and they'd roll it across. Never unloaded it, just roll it across and drop it in the other side. So major crossroads there. Jews are going to be there. No surprise that you would find them there. You don't find them in Philippi. Philippi is a different kind of a situation, more Roman in its attitude, more military, and so a few Jews, but not very many there. I just think we got to see this as we look at the New Testament to get a better grip on what we're reading and what's being talked about in those places. So Paul was, because of what we just talked about, Paul was able to enter synagogues in most of the major cities. Now you'll see him going to the synagogue, goes there first, always. Always looks for the Jews first. Even in Philippi, where there was no synagogue, he looked for the Jewish women who were down by the river praying, and that's where he went. Okay, there was also a change in worship. In the Old Testament, you have Solomon's temple, but Solomon's temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. It was torn apart, and all the goods were taken away, from there. The replacement of that, which, by the way, began to be built when? During Ezra and Nehemiah, is where we're looking at. And by the way, have you ever thought the Old Testament really ends at the end of Nehemiah, if you're talking about historically, instead of all the way down to Malachi? Now, Malachi's in that same rough time frame. Granted, that's true, but really, it ends historically. It ends with either Nehemiah or maybe Esther. If Esther's, it depends on how you place her in there. But at any rate, Zerubbabel. They call it Zerubbabel's temple because Zerubbabel was in the group that left Babylon first. You got Zerubbabel's departure from Babylon. Then you got Ezra's departure from Babylon, and then finally you got Nehemiah's departure from Babylon. So we got Zerubbabel's temple, as it sometimes is called. Then along comes a fellow by the name of Herod the Great. And Herod the Great wanted to build the Jews a better temple. Now, truth is, Herod the Great was an Idumean, and he wanted to be accepted by the Jews. So how are you going to be accepted? Let's build them a better temple. Maybe they'll love me more if I build a better temple. So he brought all the goods on site, and he didn't really start tearing down Zerubbabel's temple until the supplies to build the new temple were on site. It's kind of interesting. I wrote this out for you, copied it from Davis Dictionary of the Bible. Work commenced in the 18th year of Herod's reign, 19 BC. The main edifice was built by priests in a year and a half. So at least by 17 BC, they were done. Then the cloisters, and that's where the priests would live, the cloisters were finished in 8 years, either in 11 or in 9 BC. But the work on the entire complex of courts and buildings was not completed until the procuratorship of Albinus in AD 62 to 64. Now, what does that mean? Herod's temple was only finished and standing for about 8 years because it was destroyed when Rome destroyed Jerusalem. So, 40 years of work gone in just a few days when the Romans come in to deal with them. So what happened to worship? Well, worship really after the Babylonian captivity, or maybe in the Babylonian captivity, the synagogue became very, very dominant. There were about 17, if I remember right, 17 synagogues around Jerusalem. And so you may remember that Stephen gets in an argument with the synagogue of the freedmen. See, so they're divided into various groups there in that area. So that's where their worship primarily was in the days of Jesus. It becomes, but it's not just a worship, it's the heart of their community. Their worship's there, but they also do a lot of things there. In fact, if you get thrown out of the synagogue, you're socially an outcast. Now, you say, why bring that up? Well, wait till we get to John chapter 9. Do you remember the blind man who Jesus healed on the Sabbath? John doesn't tell us that until a little bit later in the story. But he healed him on the Sabbath, and boy, the Jewish leaders are upset about it. Who did this? Who did this? And they don't care whether he's healed or not. They care about when it was done. And so, he didn't know he was blind. Really, He didn't have a whole lot to say about it, but they asked his parents. And their parents say, well, yeah, that's our son. And yes, he was blind, but how he got healed, we don't know. He's of age, ask him. He's old enough, ask him. Of course, they asked the blind man more than once, and he finally says, well, do you want to be his disciples? Which made the Jews particularly angry about the whole thing. But the background behind that is important, because why did his parents not tell who healed him? Because they didn't want to be thrown out of the synagogue. They were afraid of losing their social standing if they didn't just ignore this thing or somehow skirt around it. Synagogues are not mentioned in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, they're really very, very prominent in New Testament times. In fact, you see them in the life of Jesus, but you also see them in the life of Paul. Both of them have a good deal to do with it, and I already said Stephen and others as well. What about changes in religious leadership? Well, there was that too. In the Old Testament, the priests were recognized as religious leaders. And so, for example, in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, who does the teaching? It's the priests. The priests teach the people about how to please God and what they've got to do to be satisfactory to God. But in Jesus' ministry, Judaism had two high priests, and Luke refers to that very early on. You got Annas and Caiaphas. And so on the night of Jesus' betrayal, guess what? He ends up going to both high priests. They lead him from one place to the other, through that entire discussion. The rabbis were leaders. You can see them referred to in Matthew 23, verses 7 and 8. The scribes, we'd call them writers or copyists. Maybe they might have had that name. They also were leaders. And so you get Jesus saying scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites, in Matthew chapter 23 in the opening verses. And then we have the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin, the best comparison we've probably got to it today is it's like the Jewish Supreme Court. Ultimate decisions are made with the Sanhedrin. It's the Sanhedrin that's involved in the trial of Jesus. They also are involved in the trial of Peter and John. They're also involved in the trial of the apostles. That's Acts 4, Acts 5. And then they're involved in the really it's an investigation, you might say, of Stephen, which is in Acts 7. They're in all of those things. Supreme Court, they're the final arbiters, as it were. By the way, the Sanhedrin is also known as the council. These leaders were determined to maintain the status quo, and therefore Jesus became their greatest foe, because they were afraid he's going to take the people away from them. They want to lose their following. And so that's why you see this constant friction between the scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, and Jesus. Just a continual, battering of heads, you might say, between those two. What about the rise of sectarianism? During Jesus' lifetime, you see that Jewish sects are primarily influenced by politics and culture, became prominent in Jesus' day. For the Pharisees, the word Pharisee, near as we can tell, means to separate. They didn't want to be associated with the Roman government at all. They were separatists. They were not violent. We're going to talk about some others that were violent. They were not, generally speaking, although they're pretty violent toward Jesus. The Sadducees were wealthy. They were aristocratic, and many of them were priests. And so high priest usually is a Sadducee, almost without exception, which is intriguing when you consider Paul's defense before the council later in the book of Acts. And he said he perceives that there's Sadducees and Pharisees there, and he says, I'm on trial because I believe in the resurrection. And all the Pharisees say, you're a good man. And the Sadducees, want to tear him apart. Okay, then you got the Herodians. The Herodians were a political group dedicated to placing Herod on the throne. They wanted Herod the Great to be the ruler, or later the other Herods. There were 5 of them in total. Then you got the Zealots. The Zealots were dedicated to wiping Rome out. And they were very notorious for being a violent people, carrying swords. It is said that they were sworn to kill anyone that was a tax collector. I find that interesting because Jesus had an apostle that was a zealot and an apostle that was a tax collector. But they didn't kill each other. So I just find that interesting. And then there are the Essenes. Now, Essenes are never mentioned in the New Testament. They're a group that withdrew and lived out by themselves. But the famous Dead Sea Scrolls are a product of the Essenes. The last thing I want to observe today, and it's part of why Matthew talks about the kingdom of heaven, is the messianic expectation. The Jews were eagerly looking for God's Messiah. The word Messiah is translated in Greek, it'd be Christ, as John tells us in John chapter 1, verse 41. Christos, according to Wren, is the dynamically equivalent Greek term for the Hebrew word Messiah. It is found over 550 times in the New Testament. The word Christ. I knew it was there a lot, but I never would have guessed 550. That's a tremendous number. Paul often talks about Jesus Christ, you may remember, or in Christ, for another example. The Jews thought that the Messiah would be a king over physical Israel, and he would run the Romans out, is what they thought. And they'd become a dominant power again. Well, of course, that did not happen. Simeon and Anna, both in the book of Luke, chapter 2, were somewhat messianic in their approach. Now, I want to be careful about them. I don't think they, either one, show any indication that they're looking for a great king who's going to defeat everybody else. They're looking for God's king. And they seem to have a better grasp of that than others of that era. So hopefully you found some tidbits that were interesting to you, that help you see the New Testament in a different light. I think that all of these things ultimately will come into play as we look at the life of Christ, and we'll start doing that next week. Now, I want to make one comment, and I think you know this about me now, after 9 years here. I'm not a bookseller. However, we're working, it's going to be myself and Derek and Ron Clemens, at least for the first quarter. I don't know if everybody will stick with us for all the way through or not. But we're working through 2 books. They're commentaries that were put out by the Truth for Today people. And they're really thick. It's Life of Christ. It's 2 commentaries, pretty good sized. Normally, those things sell for more than $30 a piece. But for the purposes of this study, they've made available to anybody that wants them, both commentaries, $16 each. I'm not a book salesman, but if you want a set of those and you're willing to pay for them, see, because I can't pay for your books and give them away. See, I'm not able to do that. But if you want a set, if you will hand me a note or hand Derek a note, Ron, would you mind collecting notes if people want one of those? Could they tell you? Okay, so any one of us 3, if you want one of a set, and please designate. If you only want one at a time, designate it. They're going to let us buy them $16 a piece, but I don't make any profit off of it. It's if you don't want one, you don't want one. It's okay with me. Yes, ma'am. It is the life of Christ. Everything we're going to study for the next year is in well. At least the essence of it's in these books. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, and we'll break and meet again in a few minutes.